Welcome to today's Atlantic Circle in Conversation event. My name is Magda Joshi. I'm the Events and Alumni Engagement Manager in the Philanthropy Partnerships and Engagement team at the college. And the event forms part of a series of online lectures, usually held on a bi-weekly basis, with the aim of re-engaging alumni and friends of UWC Atlantic and tuning into topics on a variety of issues. Today, the topic of our event is Systems Revisited. How do we educate for the 21st century? Before we officially begin this event, I just wanted to highlight a few housekeeping points. The event will last for up to 90 minutes. If you could, it would be appreciated if you could please rename yourself on Zoom, including your name as well as affiliation to UWC Atlantic or to the movement altogether. Kindly remain on mute during the duration of the event. I hope you don't mind that I might be helping by muting people during the session. Do, of course, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question later on. We will also be taking questions via the chat. So if you have any comments during the presentations, do put your comments on the chat on Zoom. We are delighted that today's event will be hosted and moderated by one of our alumni and one of UWC Atlantic governors, Lutfey Siddiqi. So without further ado, I hand over to Lutfey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magda, and welcome everyone wherever you are in the world. My name is Lutfey Siddiqi. I'm a former student and now a governor at UWC Atlantic. My day job is that of a university lecturer, and someone very unkindly said to me yesterday that my profession is going through a gramophone moment. I learned that the gramophone was invented in 1887, and before that you could be a mediocre musician and have your business running quite well within your community because you could be mediocre, but the audience didn't really know better. But once gramophone came about, everyone knew what good looked like, and so they all wanted that, and so it was game over for mediocre musicians. And so the suggestion was that mediocre lecturers like me would have to think about my profession quite carefully if we are really moving into web-based lectures because of this tragic pandemic. Which was quite a sobering thought because it is, I guess, part of the structural changes that we're going through in the world of education right now. So I will be the moderator of today's panel. It's titled Systems Revisited, How Do We Educate for the 21st Century? And indeed, how do we do that? We're in a tumble dryer with lots of different forces buffeting us at the same time. You have the fourth industrial revolution. You have the issue of planetary sustainability. We have polarized conflict being played out both within and between communities. So redesigning education was already overdue by this time last year. Now, 1 year on, we have this massive pandemic sweeping across the globe, forcing and accelerating changes in the way we work, we learn, we interact, we use technology, basically the way we live. And that has made it even more urgent that we revisit education. But to say that is one thing, and framing that in the right way, taking stock of a full range of factors, perspectives, considerations, that's something else. So we thought we should convene a discussion about this topic with 4 distinguished and diverse panelists. And hopefully very quickly, having listened to their opening remarks, we open it up to an interactive discussion with all of us. I believe there's more than 200 of us here, and let's see if we can get a lively discussion going. So with that, by way of backdrop, let me go to the first of our panelists, and I will introduce them as I invite them to speak, as opposed to everyone in one go. So let me start with Andria Zafirakou. Andrea is a teacher at Alperton Community School in Brent. And last year, in my son's school in North London, a new boy arrived, and my son asked him, "Where were you before?" And he said, "At the school that has the best teacher in the world." Andrea, I think I mentioned this to you some time back, where he was referring to Andrea and her school, because Andrea won the $1 Million Global Teacher Prize in 2018 when she was crowned the best teacher in the world. She's an art and textile teacher in Brent, on the outskirts of London, one of the world's most ethnically diverse places. Andrea founded a charity called Artists in Residence with an aim to improve arts education in schools. She was named in the top 10 of the Evening Standard's 1,000 Londoners list, and she also sits on the World Economic Forum's Council on Education. Andrea, what are your opening thoughts on education reform?
Thank you very much, Lutfey, and hello everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you this evening. If I can just reflect on that first question and just ask another one, and the other one would be what actually needs to be in place? So what needs to be in place for our young people to succeed in the future? And having a quick reflection time, having a quick think about what does this mean for me in my classroom with my 30 students, with a building of 2,000 students and 200 teachers. What does this mean for us? Well, actually what this means for us is that we would like to have some serious consideration on what the curriculum is going to be. What is the curriculum? What are we teaching them? Is it engaging? Is it experimental? Is it global? But most importantly, is it creative? The other thing I'd like to think about is assessment. What are we assessing? How do we know that our curriculum, how do we know our young people are succeeding? And what I'm not referring to is putting our young people in an exam hall for 2 weeks where they have to churn out probably about 60 exams for a period of 2 or 3 weeks. Is that what we want for our young people? Is that how we're going to know whether or not they're succeeding or not? What we do want is to have investment from industry and also partnerships with industry. We want our curriculums to be such that our students will feel that they are employable and can give back. We need technology. We need our teachers, we need our schools to be the best cutting edge places in the world. They need to be just as good as universities in terms of the facilities that they have. And we also need to think about our professionals. So we need to have the best teachers in front of our young people. And to do this, we need to have fantastic teacher training programs. We need to have fantastic school leadership programs. And we also need to have, which I think is probably the foundation of any partnership, any relationship with a school, and that's parent support. We need our parents to be with us. We need our parents to be on the same bus, facing the same direction, on that same journey, knowing that they're there and we're working together to support their young person. You won't believe the stories that I can tell you where we've lost a young person because the partnership, the support was not there from the family background. And what we do want to achieve and what we do want to have in our schools is we want to create these holistic, inclusive environments where we know that every child has got the skills, has got the toolkit for them to be able to succeed, fulfill their dreams and achieve everything which they would like to have for their futures. I'll leave it there. Sorry, Lutfey. I know I could talk forever for this, but 5 minutes is good. Is a really good benchmark for me. So thank you very much.
I will come back to you on. I think one of your bugbears is not enough arts and maybe too much emphasis on STEM. We'll talk about that in a bit. Next up is Dr. Luis Benveniste. Dr. Benveniste is the Human Development Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. He's a co-author of the World Development Report 2012, Gender Equality and Development. He's here in a private and personal capacity. Amongst his many laurels, he has a PhD in comparative education from Stanford university. Dr. Benveniste, your opening comments, please.
Thank you, and it's great to be here today. And I will offer a very different perspective from Andrea, in the sense that Andrea sort of looked very closely to the classroom, and so I'm just going to zoom out all the way back, and first start with sort of just reflecting that sort of mass basic education is a 19th century institution, but it has not changed that much. And many have argued that classrooms have largely remained the same for the past 150 years. And so the argument goes that schools today are grossly inadequate to prepare the students for the 21st century. Now, we live in a rapidly changing world, and that change is getting more and more rapid. And so we need to prepare kids for a world that is more urban, that is more integrated, where white-collar work and academic and cognitive skills are much more salient. We live in a world where jobs are changing constantly. It's often said that more than half of the jobs of 20 or 30 years have not been created yet. We live in a world where there's longer life expectancy. So lifelong learning becomes absolutely critical, where we need to reskill ourselves to have different types of jobs over time. We live in a digital world where sort of the tablets and the internet is ubiquitous, and that more and more people have access to it, and thus requires new sets of skills. But we also live in a world where there is greater opportunity, and at the same time the potential for greater inequality, where higher order skills provide a very much of a differential rate of return and have the potential of creating greater inequities in the world. In all of this, education remains a cornerstone for shaping opportunity, for shaping human opportunity, what we can do, what we can be. And so this is a foundational stone more than ever. Now, oftentimes we see in the media that national education systems are seen as failing, and particularly failing those that need it the most, the ones that are most vulnerable, the ones that are most disadvantaged, due to gender, due to race, due to ethnicity, due to disability status, due to socioeconomic conditions. And so in this context, I think that we've been hearing more and more recently how education technologies are often touted as a potential game changer. Now, the UK has one of the largest EdTech fairs in the world. I think that many of you have heard of the one laptop per child efforts, and the storyline goes that with broadband access and with a tablet, you can have access to some of the best teachers in the world, some of the best resources in the world in terms of learning, and all of this that comes through the magic of the internet. You can individualize learning by attuning tasks or attuning exercises to the level of the child, and so on. Now, in that sense, we see that tech and education technology in particular has really sort of been oftentimes equated with 21st century learning. Now then COVID came along, and all of a sudden schools shut down. Over 1.5 billion kids are out of school. Learning losses are being documented and amounting hugely. As I work in the World Bank, we did some estimations that, for example, students currently in schools tend to lose about $10 trillion in labor earnings over their work lifetime. So the losses that are mounted are tremendous. And where distance education, where technology education has become the main vehicle for maintaining school services, we're also seeing that sort of the remote learning strategies, even though they vary across countries and across educational levels, we see that even the countries that are most prepared, where they have the best technology, the best platforms, we still observe significant learning losses. And to me, sort of some of the lessons that have come out from this period is that while technology is important and can be a complement to what schools do, it's just that it's a complement to teaching. And education is not just about the what, about the content, about the curriculum, but it's also about the how. And there, the role of teachers is absolutely critical. Classrooms may look like they did 150 years ago, but what happens in a classroom, what happens in a 21st century classroom is quite different. So we've moved from front style rote learning to cooperative learning, from content driven to inquiry driven. There's a wide variety of educational offers out there that probably you all know or thought about in terms of how to support your children in relation to like progressive education, religious or value driven education, outdoor or sustainable development type of educations, obviously international understanding. So we've seen very significant shifts in how education has been presented, and we will continue to see this shift. And for me, sort of the two main educational principles that will continue to shape our thinking of how we provide education, and in relation to the promise of EdTech. And one is that learning is a social process. School is about a learning environment that on one hand respects individuality, that respects diversity, but at the same time, it's interactive and it's supported communally. And so this is a really critical element for the 21st century education. And then secondly, so learning is not just about an academic or a cognitive exercise, but the importance of social emotional skills are also absolutely critical in relation to cooperation, communication, critical thinking, resilience, perseverance, openness, empathy, understanding. All of these are the building blocks for creativity, for ingenuity, to be able to live and work in anywhere in the world, to be able to change who you are, what you do, and what you're working on according to your interests and according to your abilities. And let me pause there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benveniste. Next up is Polly Akhurst. Polly is, like me, a former student of UWC Atlantic, and we both sit on the college's education committee. Polly is a co-founder and co-executive director of Amala, formerly Sky School, a non-profit startup that has developed the first international high school curriculum for refugees and displaced youth. From working in community engagement and outreach at UWC International to her contribution to the OECD's Education 2030 project, she is committed to creating education systems that equip young people to make positive change in the world. Polly, your opening remarks, please.
Thank you so much, Lutfey, and to the team for allowing me to try to provide an answer to one of my favorite questions. So I think my starting point here, and when thinking about how do we rebuild our education systems, is really this need to ask, what is the purpose of education in the 21st century? And this is something that in many ways we've been kind of privileged to have been reflecting on deeply with Amala, because we work with young refugees who are out of school and who are not able to finish their secondary education. And really, when you work with young people who are out of the system, you just really need to think, what is the purpose of the system? So I think that there are many different answers to this question. And at Amala, we've decided that the purpose of learning that we want to provide is really to develop the agency of young people and enable them to make positive change in their own lives and in the lives of others. So if we take that, I'm going to take that as my working definition of the purpose of education for the future. What I want to ask now is, well, how do we get there? And so what I want to say here is that I think we need to change what we learn, how we assess learning, and who has access to high quality learning. So in terms of what we learn and how we learn, I think we really need to think in terms of competencies, broad competencies that young people need in the world today and in the future, and to design our curriculum and pedagogies accordingly. The OECD has done some amazing work around this as part of their Education 2030 project, and has highlighted 3 key competencies that will be essential. So number 1, taking responsibility for yourself and others. Number 2, managing complexity. And number 3, creating new value. And I think if we think at this level of kind of broad competencies, then it really allows us to think more imaginatively about our curricular focus and aligns it with the needs of today and tomorrow. And this is something that we're trying to do at Amala, where, for example, we see areas like ethical leadership and peace building as equally important to focus on as maths and science, precisely because they enable students to develop these broad competencies. And I think if we focus less on knowledge and less on the kind of teacher knowing it all, then we can focus on the teacher becoming a facilitator and really supporting holistic development of students, both within and outside the classroom, which becomes much more engaging process for both the teachers and the students. But you can have the most amazing broad curriculum, but if you have a high stakes exam at the end where you measure a very narrow set of achievements, then that is what the teachers and students will need to focus on. There's so much evidence that high stakes examinations negatively impact student well-being and are really bad for intrinsic motivation. So I think we need to go beyond, in the 21st century, we need to go beyond exams and beyond grades. And I think that we can do better, but the answers might not be easy. I do think that the good news is that there are alternatives that are emerging to these high stakes assessment methods. And one of them, for example, is the Mastery Transcript Consortium, who have developed the first gradeless high school transcript. And they're starting to gain a lot of traction in the US and increasingly worldwide among high schools. And what's unique about this kind of process is that it focuses really on, again, broad competencies that students should meet, but also it requires students to provide evidence of their learning and reflection on their learning as well. So a much kind of deeper formative process that happens while students are kind of engaged in education. Of course, a key barrier to doing something like this is that higher education systems are so used to looking at grades. But I think what is very promising with this kind of system is it actually provides a lot more insight than grades about individual students, about what they can do, and about whether they'll be a good fit in different institutions. So this brings me to the question of access. And the examination system that we have been historically so used to has been used as a way of sorting people out of a system where there were once very few opportunities, particularly at higher education level. And so that has created immense competition at both secondary, particularly at secondary level, to some extent also at primary education level. And so I think that what we need to kind of remove this pressure and this competition that still exists in the system and that is locking students out, often those students who are most socioeconomically disadvantaged, is many more high quality, affordable higher education options. And the good news, again, that this is happening. Some really good examples are of the University of the People, which is the first tuition-free university, and Arizona State University, which is providing low-cost, high-quality degrees to over 75,000 people worldwide. Just today, I found out about a new university called Nexford, which is providing BA degrees for $100 a month, which is very impressive. And I think higher education, as Lutfey said at the beginning, is undergoing its own revolution and is needing to find its own purpose. And I really think that this disruption will be key to creating more equitable and better systems at secondary and at primary education level. I want to say a few words as well about online learning and to build on some of Luis's thoughts there, really. And I think, while online learning does provide the promise of access, a lot of the areas where we work, for example, in Kakuma camp in Kenya, the level of infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure, and device access is really low. And so, that is still locking out. While the connectivity is increasing, access to devices is increasing, there are still so many millions of people who are locked out of opportunities, which in many ways would be perfect for them. And I think that this has become really evident in COVID-19. And I think what is important there is that we need to see governments taking more action to provide equitable connectivity and device access to more students. I think additionally, something that COVID has shown us is the vital role of relationships between teachers and students, and especially among those who are most disadvantaged, who might be lacking in support systems around them, and who are really at risk of dropping out of school. So I think, again, kind of building on what Luis said, that kind of, technology will not solve it all, and especially for the most disadvantaged students, I would say. And a final point, I think we really need to think about different ways of doing school and making school systems more accessible and learner-centric. And at Amala, for example, we run our program on a part-time basis, which takes into account that for our students, it is an economic necessity to work. And so I really think that kind of more innovation of looking at different ways of doing school around the world is so necessary to enable access for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly. And now drum roll for our very own Peter. But just to keep the suspense going a bit longer, could I get an indication, please? How many people are already itching to ask questions at this stage? Do we do that through hands, or Magda, what's the best way to?
I think there are two ways to ask questions after the round of presentations. You are welcome to post your comments and questions on the chat, as my colleague Carissa has just commented on, or later after the presentations, you are welcome to raise your hand or use reactions on your screen if you would like to comment or ask a question.
So I've put up a reaction, a thumbs up. Can people see that? Okay. And so are people able to do that themselves? I imagine you can go to reactions and do that. Okay. So, oh, there is one, there's two. All right. So we have a bank of questions waiting for us. So allow me to introduce Peter Howe. Peter has been with the UWC movement since 2005, when he joined UWC Adriatic. At the end of 2011, he became head of UWC Maastricht, where he stayed for 6 years before becoming principal of UWC Atlantic in March 2017. Peter holds a BCom degree in accounting, finance, and economics from Queen's University, and an MA and PhD in art and architectural history from the University of Toronto. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Lutfey, and I'd be happy to go directly to questions after being humbled by the other speakers. What do I have to add? Well, I guess I have to start with a confession, and as Lutfey indicated, I've had the privilege of spending 2/3 of my career working at UWC. So in many respects, I have a quite narrow perspective because I've been in this incredible experiment in education, which began here at UWC Atlantic in 1962. And I know we have a lot of UWCers on this call, but I remain inspired by Kurt Hahn's brilliance and how it's being confirmed by brain research over the past decade, that teenagers are willing and fully able to take on responsibility. You know, and the mantras of "there's more in you than you think" and "you are needed" really resonate with teenagers. And brain research is also showing that the teenage brain is the maximum capacity brain. So I've always felt and lived as the head of 3 UWCs that students of the teenage years have the best BS meters as well. So they know when what you are telling them is authentic or not. And we all remember, I hope, being teenagers and having that feeling about the adults that they are somewhat full of themselves. So perhaps if there are some teenagers watching, you can confirm that with our remarks this evening. But for me, what is the purpose of education at its most fundamental? It's maximizing the potential of young people. And I think, you know, we shifted in terms of what we were asking national committees to do in selecting students to attend UWC. We wanted them looking for promise and potential versus merit. Because as we've come to understand, merit is often based on opportunity, and the fact that you speak, you know, 5 languages fluently or play the violin or what have you is based on the privilege you have had growing up, versus what we felt was more important of promise and potential. And what we meant by that is what you've done with the opportunities you've had. And I think Polly's work is probably realizing precisely that with some of these incredible young people who have not had opportunity, and when they're given it, how much they blossom. So if I take as the why of education, trying to maximize the potential of young people, which of course is unknown and unknowable. So therefore our job as educators is try and nurture that and provide an environment in which they're willing to try and realize that potential, because of course that involves failure and trying and not succeeding initially. So for me, it is about the community that one creates where students feel willing and able to take on such risk, and also remembering quite well the insecurities of teenagehood, when you think everyone's looking at you all the time and you don't want to stand out, when in fact this is the time to define who you are. And I think one of the other wonderful things about the experiment that is UWC is it really underscores the power of diversity. You know, the fact that we have students at virtually every UWC from over 90 countries, from different socioeconomic backgrounds, religious, cultural, ethnic backgrounds, and you put that all together, it makes everyone realize that they are quite unique and distinct in the world, and that they all have their individual cultural identities. And I think that realization about identity is really important the earlier that takes place. So we also have the privilege of UWC of having really motivated and engaged students. And I think that as a classroom teacher, when you have motivated and engaged students, your job is bliss, you know, and so it is, how do we motivate students to take on these challenges? And I think what COVID has underscored for me more than ever is that well-being is everything. And if students don't feel safe and secure, and they don't feel that the adults that surround them don't care deeply, then they are in a vulnerable position. And when the brain is in a vulnerable position, it's not a learning brain, it's a survival brain. So we as the adults in the community must work every single day to create what I call a well-being culture, and be prepared to critically analyze our processes and how we approach things to make sure that the student can authentically feel well supported. And this is where summative exams at the end of the process are such a betrayal of that trust. When you're telling them it doesn't really matter, you know, whether you're able to memorize everything, it's all about effort and engagement and realizing your potential. And then they're judged by these summative exams that don't even allow you to say who you are, that you're a number on a page, I think is an absolute betrayal. So we definitely have to get a better handle on assessment. I think the other thing for me, and once again, this is the difficult journey through puberty towards adulthood, is normalizing asking for help. Because we've also created a culture where showing weakness or vulnerability is looked down upon. And especially once again, with the way universities assess students, if you have any blemish on that transcript, which is why I love, you know, the mastery transcript, then you will not be eligible anymore. So they have this absolute fear of being found out, that they are not these perfectly formed individuals before they go off to university. So I'm a huge fan of Carol Dweck's work. I'm sure you all know of the growth mindset. And I, in reading that book about 15 years ago, I guess it was a revelation to me, because I did have that fixed mindset. I did think I was a fraud. I did think every day throughout teenagehood, university, my working life, that I was going to be discovered as not being what everyone thought I was. So the idea that you could be vulnerable, that you could show that you didn't know everything, that you could admit that there was more to be learned and that you wanted to learn, I think was incredibly liberating. So I think that's critically important as well. And then finally, I am an absolute believer in experiential education. I think even the word teacher in itself is probably one that needs redefining. You can learn from everybody in a community. You know, it takes a village to raise a child. I would say it's the same for educating a young person. You know, they can learn from everybody who they come in contact with at the school. So for me, when I talk about the role of teachers, I remember the HR manager at Maastricht when I described what I expected of a teacher in terms of the support they would give for students, of serving alongside students, of sharing their passions, of running activities. she said to me, why do you call them teachers? Because if you go and advertise for someone with a certain subject speciality, you get that very narrow frame. So I was really happy that Andrea talked about teacher training, because I think the way teachers are currently trained is also the old paradigm. And of course, teachers are afraid of showing they don't know anything or being vulnerable. To win that job, you have to do a perfect lesson in front of somebody, and then you're selected for doing it, versus also selecting teachers, or educators, I would prefer to say, on their promise and potential, and be willing to allow them as school leaders to make mistakes. But as long as they care deeply, as long as they are there for the student, then they have a place at the school I would want to leave. So I've just had this incredible privilege over my 16 years at UWC of learning from the students and really reevaluating what I do every day in order to create that environment in which potential can be realized.
Thank you, Peter. Let's go to the chat for some questions. The first one I see is from David Samore. We know how education today should be. What are the main obstacles that are stopping us from executing on these strategies? How do we get from the present to the future is the gazillion-dollar question, I guess. Who would like to take this question?
I'll
Peter?
start the ball rolling, Lutfey, and it's the confession of a parent. I think managing parent fear is my #1 challenge. And I do think this obsession with, in this country, league tables and all these other things is about parental fear. And of course, politicians respond to that because it's an easy win to give them a promise that, oh, if you just vote for me, I will deliver this system which will guarantee, the future security of your kids. So I getting parents to back off, and recognize that every young person is a unique individual with their own path in the future is a huge challenge. I think it's probably my #1 challenge, because I think that's where I have the privilege of working at a residential school, because I have the kids 24/7, so I can really literally have the parents back off with respect to that. So I do think we're all superstitious individuals. I am successful in life, so I want my kids to do exactly what I did, because obviously my success is based on the pathway that I took to get where I am. And that's where, once again, the human brain fails us, because we all have selective memory. We can all explain perfectly well how we ended up where we are today. But if you asked me even 10 years, 15 years ago, would I be leading UWC Atlantic, I would have laughed in your face. I would have said, there's no way I will ever be doing that job. So I think it is about managing parent fear and working alongside them, as Andrea said, to say, if you give your kid that space and you entrust us as educators to have their best interests at heart and help them realize their potential, then you will be rewarded for the faith that you've placed in us.
Would any of the others like to take that, Luis?
I probably Andra is much more qualified to talk about this than I am. I think that one of the most important channels is teaching and good teaching, and being a teacher is incredibly hard. Being able to be in front of a classroom with 20, 30 kids of very different abilities, of very different backgrounds, and being able to be attuned to what their needs are, to be able to sort of provide individualized support, to being able to respond to their particular interests, but at the same time maintaining a relatively homogeneous classroom and get things going. When you're under a lot of pressure to deliver a certain curriculum in a certain amount of time, to test kids in a certain way, it's truly sort of a remarkable feat, and one where also the status of teaching in our society has been in many ways in the decline, and where the recruitment of teachers are in many countries it's not what it used to be in terms of being able to attract the most skilled or the most gifted. And so I think that, you know, being able to truly sort of help support and rethink the teaching profession, to mobilize, you know, around teachers, and to be able to provide them with the both human as well as technical resources for them to really come to in front of a classroom and being able to again manage that, to carry through in terms of delivering the potential that education has. We know that education is one of the most important avenues for social mobility. We know that it is one of the most important avenues to break intergenerational cycles of poverty. But all of that sort of rests in many ways in the shoulders of teachers, and that's a huge responsibility.
Andrea and Polly, would you like to take this question, or should we move to the next one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Luis and Peter really kind of inspired my thinking there, because if I was to reflect on what I did today, so I'm a well-paid teacher, I'd say, in my school. I'm a leader in my school. So I was dealing with social services. I was dealing with the police this morning. I had to we had to go to the nurses station. There was a problem there. Food, making sure that some of our young people were fed, and then I taught. So my question here is, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could just teach and do what I absolutely love doing, and that's inspiring young people with my subject? That's what I want to do. But all the other things get in the way, which are really important. And without dealing with those, the teaching can't happen. So what needs to happen, David? I think huge investment in terms of putting the infrastructure in for schools to be able to do what they need, for teachers to do what they need to do. And then Luis said something really inspiring, and he said about the state, he was talking about the status of teachers. So I've had the privilege of speaking and working with many ministries of education and with teachers and just liaising. And I've noticed that the countries, the teachers which are doing really, really well are the ones whereby they have the ownership, the status of being a highly respected professional, whereby the Ministry of Education supports them. They give them ownership. They respect their professional judgment in terms of assessment, in terms of what curricula to deliver for their students. So they are valued. They are respected. Countries which don't have that same ethos or culture is where there's a much more of a top-down heavy approach, and they feel unsupported. So we need to have a look at the balance there. You know, it's not an easy fix. Some countries do things really, really well. Some countries don't do things really well. But at the end of the day, I think the key thing is just to kind of ensure that the value of and professionalism of teachers is higher than what it is at the moment.
Polly?
Yeah, just to build on what Andrea was saying, I think the best educational systems in the world are those that trust teachers. And I think Finland, for example, has a highly decentralized system where there are broad curricular goals set at national level, but they have a high trust in teachers being able to deliver that curriculum and to have autonomy. And so I think, you know, governments are responsible for holding up a lot of the change that needs to happen, also out of fear of a loss of control, out of fear of moving away from a curriculum that is quite nationalistic in many cases in nature as well. So I think we shouldn't forget governments when we talk about the need for change, and they are kind of at the end of the day in charge of changing policy around curriculum and assessment. And I think the other stakeholder that I mentioned is higher education institutions. And because really so much of the demands, particularly at secondary level, are driven by their needs or what they think are their needs. And so I really think that we need to convince the higher education institutions that there are better ways to select for students than a grade on a sheet of paper.
So Polly, while I have you here, there is a question exactly on that from Beatrice, AC 76 to 78. How do we change universities' admissions policies? How do we overcome this obsession with rankings that Peter mentioned? And there's another question that's related to that, which says, how do we get out of this mindset that going to university is the pinnacle of education, that it's a much there are a much broader set of options available. So universities, how do we deal with this problem?
It's a massive question. I think we need to work actively with universities to find out what it is that they really want, because the grades currently are a form of signaling, right? And a lot of university admissions people take a quick look at the grades, you know, are they there? Are they not? Okay, move on. So all of this work that students put in years and years and years to try to get these really good grades is a few seconds of them looking at a sheet of paper. And I think this is where, again, I mentioned the Mastery Transcript Consortium, and where they're doing really, you know, useful work is in working with universities to figure out what kind of students you actually want, okay, and then what information can we provide you, and how can we ensure that that is kind of fair, verified information to enable you to get really good students. So I think we have to proactively work with universities to figure out, for them to figure out what they really want, would be the answer to the first question.
Peter?
Yeah, it is a massive question, but I think part of it as well is that universities need to respect what is done at secondary school. And it's not just about identifying the biggest brains. You know, it's a little bit like the corporate world. I remember my first job, I got into teaching much later. They basically said, forget everything you learned at university and we're going to train you, you know, to do what we need you to do. And I think that's pretty much still true. And universities do the same. They don't really care what you learned at high school. They just want the best and the brightest, and then they'll take over and they'll shape them the way they wish. So in terms of what universities are looking for, I think that's a really interesting question. But ultimately, academia is exactly that. Like the system as it's currently structured is to train university professors, you know, which is a very small segment of the population. And this idea that you could switch your interests, you know, from one thing to the other while at university, this is where I do think the British really are well behind, you know, the liberal arts tradition, because I think for our kids, you know, an undergraduate degree is what a high school degree was, you know, 30 years ago. So it's a time of self-discovery and exploration. And I think universities need to create those environments as well. I expect it's going to take some pilot where relationships are trusted. I mean, I'm doing work with CIS, which accredits both universities and high schools. And the idea being that, hey, just trust us. We will tell you sort of the highest growth, you know, potential realizers that we have here, and you take them and don't even ask for any marks or anything else, but we'll be honest with you. And when they see how well those kids do and flourish in their systems, then maybe we can break away. But right now they're also looking for efficiencies. How, as university admissions people with those thousands of applications, are you going to get through it? And that's where SATs and you know, average IB scores and everything else are such an easy discriminator, because they actually don't have to think. You know, it's just a number, and they can throw away half the pile and start really focusing in on a few more. So I think it's a much bigger question of the why of tertiary education, and hopefully that's where the other pathways will develop beyond traditional academia.
Just before Adrian left, he made a comment that it would seem that the purpose of education, or the current secondary level grades-based education, is to weed out people. So how do we eliminate based on those grades? And so that then carries on to later stages. Maybe we'll see if people would want to speak themselves and ask the questions directly. Is there a Clara? Clara, would you like to ask your question in person? If not, I'm very good at mansplaining. I can do that.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I'm currently studying for being a future teacher in Spain. So you have talked about new aims of education focused on, for example, social-emotional skills, for example. And I was wondering if you have any, for example, examples of people or schools that are carrying out some kind of programs related with that, or some bibliography that you can suggest us that I can share with my classmates for focusing on education right now on this topic of social issues and ethics.
Any references on any of these?
Lots of possible references. I think that there is, we already talked about, Carol Dweck. Angela Duckworth has been doing also lots of interesting work about, sort of grit and perseverance. I think that there is a very rich, I think, just being part of the UWC movement, Kurt Hahn is, and his work on educational philosophy and the importance of we have more in us than we realize. It's a really, I think, I remember sort of reading it a number of years ago as to sort of how transformative it was for me as a person who works in education in terms of the understanding sort of how values and how the elements of being able to inquiry-based learning, inquisitive-based learning, sort of are really critical elements on instilling a set of foundational social-emotional skills that sort of really sort of open up your world. Obviously, I think that in terms of approaches to pedagogy, either whether it's Montessori education or many of the related sort of educational philosophies will all sort of will give you some grounding as to sort of how to think about education. Is not just about academic learning, but it's about learning a battery of skills really for life.
Okay,
Great.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you, Lewis. There is a question from Mr. Michael Evans, AC 67. I'm afraid I will not be able to do justice to the question. Would you like to ask it yourself?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm involved in teaching doctors who want to explore more holistic approaches to medicine. And I'm very much aware that conventional science, while it's given us huge potential, has also brought huge problems, the ecological ones being almost the most exemplary. And I think fundamental is the fact that conventional reductionist science splits the observer from nature. It doesn't actually foster empathy, either with human beings or, in this case, with nature. And I'm interested in methodologies which can change the individual's relationship to nature, actually establish the relationship, establish empathy, perhaps use non-sectarian spiritual practices to combine art with science. I've been very much impressed by what Goethe offers to science as a holistic approach. And I'm very much aware that education has to inculcate the basics, teach ordinary science, but I wonder whether there are examples where almost seeds of a kind of future relationship between the individual and nature is bridged, is cultivated, really.
Okay, should we see?
And many of the things that have been said about
take that question.
Yeah.
I'm so glad I didn't try and paraphrase that. So who would like to go with that? How do we educate? Andrea.
Michael, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to have the solution here, but just to give you an idea of an experience which I practice at the moment. So in order for me to organise to take a trip, to take my students to London, to visit a museum, to visit a park, to visit whatever, the risk assessment forms I have to fill out, honestly, it sometimes makes me think, what is the point? And then you have the battle in school whereby you have to produce your trip letter to the senior leadership team, who are going to ask me, what are the subjects they're missing? Are they missing core subjects? Are they missing English, maths and science? Because if they're going to miss those subjects, to take the kids out, no, it's not going to happen. So I constantly battle with trying to kind of, and I agree with you, there does need to be more experimental learning. Our young people, the best lessons that you ever have are the ones which are different, which are either outside or you did something different in the classroom. You're more creative. And I think we do need to try and find ways in which we engage more, not just with textbooks, but with other types of inspiration for our young people as well, because that's what they remember. That is what learning is all about. And it's going back to what Peter said earlier about we need to instill lifelong learning, and this is what's going to happen.
Peter?
Just lovely to see you, Michael. I remember you from the reunion and the interesting chats we had. But for me, another really important consideration is time. You know, you sort of allude to that, Andrea, with organizing a school trip and the time it takes, but the time the students have to engage meaningfully with their environment, because the current IB, you know, with all its assessment and reflection, forced reflection, et cetera, gives the student no time to actually engage with nature. So we're also working to try and liberate our students from the IB and develop interdisciplinary courses that are nature-based. You know, we have a young music teacher who just wants to take them into the forest, you know, and start asking them to identify plants, you know, because how many students can name 10 different trees, you know, or engage with the seafront. We're working on an ocean systems and coastal management, like to observe closely the world around you. And that's the other sort of downside of technology, is the attention span of young people is so short now, because they literally flick through everything. So to take the time to observe carefully is a real skill, and can be a revelation for young people. But we need time as educators, which means we can't have to teach to an exam where, you know, if you take this time out of the curriculum, they're not going to be able to answer question 5B, you know, on the exam. So I think how we give educators time, and I would go back, you know, I don't even like the term teacher training. I have another confession to make. I'm completely unqualified to teach. I never went to teachers college. I fluked my first job and I've been making it up ever since. But what I discovered was a passion for working with young people and working alongside them. And I do think, just as we discount students quite early in their development, and Chris Howarth, I saw a nice comment from you about where you really should be starting, and let's do Montessori all the way through. But we discount adults as well. You know, that you basically, to qualify as a teacher, you have to decide, you know, at university, and then, you know, a place like Finland, as much as I respect them, you need a master's degree in the subject in order to be qualified to teach the subject. Now, if we honestly believe in lifelong learning, and I'd like to believe I'm evidence of it. I mean, I taught IB history. I never took a history course in university, you know, and I was like one lesson ahead of the kids in my first year, but I saw it from their perspective as well, because I was learning alongside them. So this idea that what we want are passionate adults who care deeply about young people, full stop. And we can train them to be teachers while they're working with us. You know, it doesn't have to be fully formed out of, you know, teachers college, which is completely artificial, right? Teaching is live theater. How do you manage, like Andrea, once again, how do you manage that day where you're dealing with the police, you're dealing with, you know, food services, et cetera? That is a lived experience. How do you stay calm, Andrea? How do you do it? You know, how do you then have the energy to go in front of your classroom? Some people have it and some people don't. I mean, I do believe in the growth mindset, but I also believe it takes a certain ability to take a deep breath, let the class go where it's going, to intuitively know when the class is going in a good direction that will lead to interesting outcomes, or need to stop this right now because they're just wasting my time, as creative students do. So I think we also need to reassess what it means to be an educator, which is why I'd like every employee at a school to be given the opportunity to educate. So we have Tony the stonemason. You know, I invited a couple of years ago to come and help us with the building service. He knows more about building than I do. I'm running a service, you know, fixing the steps. He actually trained them how to do stonemasonry, you know, and now he knows the students by first name, and they, hey, Tony, how's it going? And his quality of life as an employee here is exponentially better than it was when he was just silently working away on the castle. So I think there's huge opportunities for engaging adults in this enterprise.
Thank you.
The big challenge of education is that where, on one hand, you know, education systems are greatly homogenizing, because, you know, you have one classroom with 30 kids, and you have a curriculum to deliver, and the system is such that it channels, you know, everybody to get to a particular endpoint. At the same time, sort of, I think that the big challenge that educators have is how do you, you know, sort of be able to sort of to see each child for his or her own strengths, with his or her own interests, and how to sort of being able to sink into their own abilities, into their own, to work with what they've got, and follow their own path, while again, sort of, having to follow a very specific channel, a specific approach that each classroom has. So I think that's the huge balancing act that educators have to play, and it's to being able to keep things in that sort of perspective is just a really tough act, and that not necessarily educators are trained to do or follow, in many sort of what teacher training programs, and also where parental expectations are such that sort of, there's a societal expectation of what the quote unquote good student is, and so again, the system pushes everybody to follow through.
Thank you. I see that Dan Bennett and David Samore have made more than one comment, and there might even be a question hidden in there somewhere. Would you like to, one of you like to come on the microphone, and Dan?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's really I work at Brighton University, so it's really interesting listening to the perspective about change and development, and certainly from the early years. I think the frustration that I've got, and I maybe didn't phrase my question very well, is that there is so much focus on teaching to a test. We hear this from students all the time. Will this be in the exam? What do I need to pass? There's this inherent fear and risk in failing. And I think there's something systematically wrong in the education system, that as educators, we're all assessed by how many of our students pass the test. It drives you nuts. So how do we try and overcome that fear of risk and failure in education, going all the way back to when we're told, you've got to pass this, you've got to get this grade, we need this, because it comes all the way through, and it goes beyond even now, colleagues working in industry and business who just can't take the risk. And I think Andrea was saying early on, global, engaging, experimental, creative risk assessment. How do we, what method is there, or what tool is there, a tool to overcome that fear of failure, which I think underpins a lot of what these challenges are?
Fear of failure. Who'd like to take that?
I don't have an answer. If somebody's got any idea, it would be awesome.
Well, my easy answer is, if the student feels safe and supported, then failure doesn't impact one in the same way. It doesn't feel like failure, it feels like learning. I mean, young people, back to Chris' point, at 4 and 5, kids have no, watch a toddler learn how to walk. I mean, they're not, oh no, I fell again. I'm not going to try anymore. I mean, and that's the lovely thing about working with primary age kids, is they don't have that fear of failure. And I think the whole idea for me of secondary education is managing puberty and the insecurity of puberty, and not wanting to stand out, or at least in a bad way, not wanting to stand out. So I think it is, Pink Floyd got it right with, we don't need no education, when they said no dark sarcasm in the classroom. I think that teachers really have to be incredibly careful of not taking the cheap shot, the easy shot, or shaming, which is, a British pastime. I mean, it really does have to be about being there to catch the kid when they fall down, as you would a toddler, dust them off. You don't go, oh my goodness, are you hurt? You just pick them up, and if you don't show fear, they'll walk off, even though they just smacked their head. And I think we could do the same with students if they felt truly supported. I forget the author's name, but there's a great book called Excellent Sheep. He's like a Princeton professor, and with these perfect kids who've never experienced failure, the first time they don't do well at university, they collapse. And I do think part of the mental health challenge is that they haven't been trained to deal with setbacks, because they've had to be perfect to get where they are, and they're terrified that they'll be found out. So back to that, growth mindset, et cetera. So it's about a whole nurturing process, which is, for me, this increasing revelation that well-being really is everything, and everything else will come out of that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Polly, did you want to come in on this question?
Yeah, I think building on that, I think even in systems where you maybe don't have exams, for example, there is that presence. And I think it's really interesting looking at project-based learning, for example. There's often a pressure to produce this amazing project that is going to wow everyone. And so like it doesn't necessarily get rid of that fear using those kind of more progressive pedagogies. And I think there needs to be more focus on not kind of how good is your project or your essay or your thing, but what have you learned from the process of doing this? What have you learned about yourself? What can you transfer to other things afterwards? So putting that kind of emphasis from how good is this thing that you've produced to what have you learned in that process gets the kind of the metacognition going and the reflection on kind of on the learning process that is transferable to so many other things. So I think, yeah, that's just one idea to throw in there.
Okay.
And it's a bit of a reflection of what we were discussing before, which is of sort of this role that schools have in sorting, kids, who are the good ones and who are the not so good ones, and also providing a primacy to sort of, again, certain types of academic learning over other types of learning. So again, so being able to continue to fall back on the notions that there are multiple intelligences, that sort of, that the importance of diversity, that everybody's good at different types of things. And being able to again to nurture that as a school culture really becomes also like a breeding ground for moving beyond failure or succeeding, but it's about trying and learning.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take a question from here. With COVID, we have home confinement with remote education and learning and loss of human contact and loss of actual real life experience learning. How will these influence the structure of teaching in the future? What will the next pandemic do to education? So that's one question. Let me mix it with a question that I have. And my question is to you, Luis, because you mentioned EdTech, technology in education. Do we have a complicated relationship with technology? Is there a prejudice almost that you somehow insult the sanctity of in-person education by embracing technology? And technology should just be used as at a bare minimum, as a camera that we can speak into, but the rest of the class is exactly how it would have been. So should technology be used as an approximation of real life classroom experience, or should we be using it in really creative ways, VR and AR and all sorts of other things? So let me combine these two questions and throw it at you guys.
So maybe I'll start. I think that in terms of the legacy of COVID, I mean, COVID has been a major unexpected experiment in education. Schools shut down worldwide, in a matter of weeks, and all of a sudden, all kids were at home. And first, I think there was the big parental shock as to sort of, okay, how do we handle kids being at home all day? Secondly, sort of the realization that sort of the importance and the value that teachers bring. As a parent, all of a sudden having to be sort of the teacher assistant to my kids who are trying to learn from home was like, I don't know how you do this, and how hard the teaching and learning process is. And then I think that again, as the weeks have gone by and we've experimented and adjusted, I think that you 1,000 flowers bloom in terms of how different school systems have tried to adapt and how to use a combination of technology and TV and radio and printed materials and sort of inquiry-based learning, independent type of learning. I think that is we're beginning to see that there's a wide variety of approaches that potentially can come back into the classroom when things go back into normal. Now that said, also I think that the other lesson from COVID has been that sort of the great promise. Before the pandemic, sort of in my work, I saw that sort of there was a great vision that if everybody had access to EdTech, learning would sort of be hugely differential. That sort of, that we could move from a situation where, nowadays, for example, in pretty much the average 10-year-old in the world cannot read a paragraph and understand its content. So about 50% of kids do not reach minimum proficiency in basic learning in basic literacy at age 10. And so EdTech was seen as a major sort of promise of sort of being able to sort of change and move the needle there. And now I think that we're seeing that, the interactive element of learning, the social aspects of learning, the pedagogy, teaching pedagogy, how to be a good teacher, are really sort of absolutely critical elements in the teaching and learning process, and to really sort of make a difference in the lives of kids, in the basic competencies of kids. You need to have an engagement. That sort of the engagement element of education is absolutely critical for success.
Anyone else with that question? Andrea, Polly? Andrea first and then Polly, sorry.
Oh, Polly, you're always going second. But I will go. Right, if anyone wants to tell me that I'd have to go home and start teaching from my computer, from my laptop again, I think I would scream. It was a horrible experience in the first place because, okay, I in many schools where students have got the benefits of having laptops and the parental support at home, and in the reality doesn't exist. I think what happened to us was that we saw where the deprivation was, we saw where the inequality was. Students who were very independent, who had the support at home, were thriving, they were just getting on with it. However, what was the focus on their mind is, Miss, am I doing this correctly? Miss, am I making progress? So they still were experiencing such a huge amount of pressure. Not only that, they were spending too long on the computers or too long online. So when you said that, Lutfey, I just had a bit of a panic attack inside of me, going, "Oh my God, I don't want to be back at home teaching again from the screen," because you're right, Luis, you're right, absolutely right. Our young people love being in school because of the social element. They learn better from each other. As teachers, we can correct misconceptions there and then. We don't have to wait until we see the work at the end of it. And I teach a practical subject, so my intervention, where I think my presence is needed best, is just after I introduce the lesson, when they start the work. And I can't guarantee that I will ever have 30 students in a screen in front of me, and that's where your heart breaks, because you know that those other young people that they've just missed so much work from an experience which they can't pay back.
Polly?
Yeah, this builds on both Andrea's and Luis's points, but I think from our work during the pandemic, we had to shift all of our learning online as well, and we're working on sites like in Greece and in Jordan, also in Kenya, where there have been really varied levels of internet access and device access, as I said. And I think, working with students like our students who are incredibly vulnerable in very precarious positions, where some of our students are homeless, and where are they going to go to study? There's nowhere open in lockdown for them to study, let alone some of the technical requirements. I think we need to think about the techno-utopians have said online learning will be a solution for everyone. It's going to be so easily scalable. It's going to be so cheap. It's going to be all these kind of things. But I think you need these, you need connectivity, you need a device, you need a safe place to study. And you also need a greater level of self-direction and ability to study independently, which I think is hard for a lot of students who are from disadvantaged backgrounds and dealing with stuff already in their lives, and where they need the school also as a social place, a place to come to get away from some of those issues as well. I think it becomes a lot easier. So like myself, I'm taking an online Danish course right now. It's great. I can study it online for one evening a week, and then on a kind of synchronous platform, and then use an asynchronous platform. But I have, you know, I have been in a lot of kind of learning situations where I have learned how to do that self-study piece. So it's great for some students and maybe potentially different levels of education, but it's not great for everyone, and especially those who are most disadvantaged, I think.
And Lutfey, if I may, I just want to respond also to a comment from Judy Peretz, who's my second year. Hi, Judy, and she's right. EdTech is a huge term and a huge umbrella that encompasses a whole bunch of stuff, and it's important to differentiate and also not to underestimate the huge contributions that EdTech have made to the education space in terms of the bringing the types of resources, information, also as you mentioned, sort of, you know, the technologies such as VR and AR that are able to, you know, to bring types of experiences to kids and to young adults around the world that would be absolutely inaccessible without the technology. So again, I think the technology has made huge contributions.
Thank you, Luis. I also saw somebody picked up on the previous thread about failure, how to overcome fear of failure. And somebody just said, well, how about celebration of failure? And it reminds me, I think it was in the college. I was there late last year, and just outside the dining hall, there is a notice board where people post their letters of rejection from universities. I thought it's an amazing thing. The entire board is full of rejection letters, and they celebrate it. So it's already happening, it would seem. Could I ask Rian Hamill? Rian, would you like to ask a question, please?
Hi, Lutfey. Yes, thank you. And for moderating this with such good humor. It's really enjoyable. It's particularly enjoyable because I'm with my fellow Fletcher House alum, Luis Benveniste. He and I representing Wales and Argentina in a way that's only recently been seen in the Falkland Islands, not to such great effect. So this is really fantastic. I wanted to ask about the IB. I know that Atlantic College under Peter's stewardship is sort of rethinking the IB, and I wanted to ask in particular the others about whether it remains fit for purpose relative to other alternatives. It should be really better than fit for purpose if you think of its tradition of innovation. You know, where are we in thinking about the IB? Is it best practice or is it far from best practice? I think I know a little bit about where Peter what he thinks about this, but I'd love to hear from others. Thanks, Lutfey.
Thank you. Peter.
No, she doesn't want to hear from me, Lutfey. She's heard enough from me.
Okay.
I just say though, because Rian, I know you discovered the middle years program, and you know it is back to Chris Howard's point. I think one of the challenges of education, like if you think about the most interesting experiments and approaches in education, they're almost all primary school age, and we're allowed to mess with primary school kids because it doesn't really matter. And then you get into middle school and have to get a little bit serious, and then by high school it's like crack the whip and make them jump through the hoops like the lion tamer. And I think it is about capturing the spirit of that primary age education and extending that as far as we can through the education system. I would argue through university as well, because once again, those are the most creative kids. I mean, you go in a primary classroom, it just blows your mind, some of the things they come up with. And this is, I think, where technology potentially can really help. I remember at Maastricht, I had to judge, the space station farm, and their primary limitation was, how do I make a toilet out of an egg carton? It was about technology. And I thought, if you could give them an iPad, with these design things, imagine, these stations they'd be able to design from their imagination. So I do think, the IB learner profile, which I think is quite profound in some of its ideas, that was developed to assess the primary years program because they didn't want summative assessment, obviously, for primary. And the middle years interdisciplinary approach, I think, is fabulous. But then by the time you get to the diploma, it's very traditional. So it's how do you stretch that through the system, I think.
Anyone else on whether the IB is fit for purpose? Polly?
I mean, I would say with the IB, it's kind of, the way that I think about it is it's kind of like the best of a bad lot, in that, you know, there are things about the IB that are really good in terms of, you know, the interdisciplinary nature, although as Peter said, that's more obvious at certain levels, the focus on understanding concepts, the ability to study a whole range of different areas. When I was at AC, I studied West Asian history, for example, that you wouldn't get in the, say, traditional British system. But I think where it really falls down is, well, it is not interdisciplinary enough, and it is still quite discipline based, especially at diploma level. But secondly, is also just the assessment, right? That at the end of the day, you've done all this kind of learning and you've done all this community service and you've explored these different areas, and then you're just tested in the way that, you know, huge amounts of 3-hour exams. And I did, I think about a year ago, I had a conversation with the director of innovation at the IB, I think, and she said, you know, the thing is that we want to go beyond exams. We don't necessarily want to do this, but they're the most fair way to measure student achievement. And so I think that there's just a kind of a lack of imagination and creativity and thinking about what else could this look like. And the IB has become in many ways a victim of its own success, I think, in terms of the way that it has spread and scaled to so many different schools around the world. But I think that it's kind of been drawn into the system in a way of kind of very high stakes examinations and this kind of thing. And I think it sees that is what is needed for its recognition as well. Yeah.
Okay. Best of a bad lot. I think it was great as a startup, and now having had to scale and standardize and all of that. I wanted to really spend the last few minutes with Andrea because I think there's a bit of an in-group here of people who are familiar with EWCs and IBs and so on. I really want for us to learn from Andrea's specific experiences. Andrea, there's two things that I wanted to ask you to share with us, please. One is how you give effect to diversity. You know, we mentioned in your introduction that you have a really diverse group of students, some with extremely disadvantaged backgrounds, and how you deal with that range of situations. And the second question I wanted to ask you is, why did you set up this art thing? Clearly you found a
thing, love it.
a need for that. And I think there, if I understand it correctly from our previous conversations, there is a link between the two. So over to you, please.
I love that, an art thing. That's it. That's my takeaway. Thank you so much, Lutfey. So, how do I support diversity? I think what I've noticed through the years that I've been working in my particular school. So, I work in a school in the city of Brent, and we've had the highest numbers of COVID that you could think of, just on our high street. And we've got 2,000 members of staff on 2,000 students. And from those students, the majority of them are receiving free school meals. We have high percentage of students who are under the special educational needs units, shall we say. And we have 125 different languages spoken in our school, so it's extraordinarily diverse. But what is unique about that experience is the fact that we do celebrate the diversity by making sure that within our schemes of learning in our work, we are sharing their cultures. And this is where the arts is such an incredible place to do this. And one of my most humbling moments is when we receive students from countries from India, and they've just they more or less have not been in the school since coming to the country. So they could be 11-year-old, 12-year-old. If they come to the UK, they've not been in the school. But what we've noticed is that just because they can't speak English, it doesn't mean they don't have the aptitude or the ability. And students who are special educational needs or they have language skills, where they thrive is in the arts. They thrive in the arts because the arts are subjects whereby you don't need to necessarily speak English or write English. It has its own language. And we mentioned, yes, a few minutes ago on students feeling confident to learn, feeling confident to take risks. Well, actually, what the arts do, it gives them a sense of pride. And it gives them a sense of achievement, personal achievement. The students are creating work, and we're talking about working in like drama as well as fine art and music as well. But they're creating something which is unique to them, which is just as good as anyone else's. So if you can imagine a young person who's coming in with a reading age of 15 years old and they're 12 years old, compared to a child in the same class who's got a reading age of 6, but their work looks similar, it looks just as good. I can't tell you how much confidence and joy that brings to the young people, and that's what makes them thrive. So I do believe that creativity and the arts and having those moments of imagination and being inquisitive and collaborating with other people is what I think really helps to bring strong curriculums and strong learners and fantastic outcomes. And so, as Lutfey said earlier, I did win an incredible award. It was still, when I pinch myself to think, actually, I went through that and I received that, but I won an award and it came with a wonderful gift of $1 million. And so I was challenged at that point, and I was asked, well, what are you going to do with the money? And then I decided I'm going to put the money where my mouth is. I'm going to make sure that I advocate what I passionately believe in. And I do passionately believe that the arts in education do have huge transformational skills for young people. And so what we do in our charity, and our charity is called Artists in Residence, or AIR, we bring artists from all backgrounds into the schools where they work and create a collaborative project with teachers which are experienced by the young people, simply because I know that when I was studying to become, or when I was at school, my parents didn't want me to study art because there was no jobs in it. And many of our young people also have that same pressures from their families. There's no future in the arts. So what I hope to achieve is inspiration, and we are doing really, really well. It's all about just making sure that there is some kind of joy, ambition, inspiration back in teaching in one form or another.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andrea.
Thank you.
So we are now just past 2 a.m. here in Singapore, which means it's time now for me to hand it back to Magda. Before I do that, I just want to thank you all for a very rich dialogue, and there's a lot more in the chat room. I hope, Magda, we can save these and perhaps share them amongst us. But I will sign off now with my gratitude and hand you to Magda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lutfey. Yes, of course, we will have a record of these discussions and questions for future reference. The session will also be recorded, is being recorded and will be available for future viewing on our YouTube channel. I would just like to, above all, thank all of our panelists and our host for taking part today and for these amazing discussions, very thought-provoking comments. We at UWC Atlantic are all very grateful for your time and insights on the state of education and what can be done better, which I hope the college can pave the way for going forward with our Changemaker curriculum. For those of you who are attending and have seen the chat, we've posted a link to our post-event feedback form, and my colleague Carissa posted that a few minutes ago. So if you have comments about today's session, please do let us know. We will also be sending an email to those of you who are happy to hear from us by email with the link to this form. If you'd like to share your feedback with us, we're always happy to hear how we can continue improving these events, although today's session was simply amazing. And we hope to welcome many of you back to our future sessions. We have another one confirmed for the 19th of November, so we hope you will be able to join us. Once again, thank you very much to all of the panelists and to Lutfey, our moderator and host. All the best.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye.